Hello friends, welcome to Mule Fusion YouTube channel. Today I want to talk about target variable in Mule-4 connector. So what is a target variable in Mule-4 connector? Earlier in deliverables of Mule like Mule-3, if a flow invokes any service like take the example, this is a flow A, assume this is flow A. Flow A takes the request from any client like HTTP client, and while processing this request there are some message processors. Okay. So till this point there is some payload X is there. Assume there is payload X. There is some payload, it is X. Okay. Now this is one of the outbound connector. It connects, it calls a service, web service. Okay. When it calls a web service, the response returned from the web service, it overrides the existing payload. So assume the response coming from the web service is Y. So after this connector, now the payload is not X, it is X is overwritten by the Y. Okay, now the payload is new payload is Y. So sometimes you need sim this payload in this flow. Okay. In such case, what you need to do is you need to store this payload in a variable before invoking this service. So create a variable. In this variable, store a payload, store the existing payload, then call the service, and whenever required, you can take this payload X from this variable. Okay. This is one way, and other way is you need to use the message enricher. So in the Mule 3, there is a component called message enricher. You need to call the service in the message enricher. So it is like this. The flow gets the message, okay, and there are some message processors, and this is an outbound endpoint where it calling the web service. Web service, okay. So at this, you need to call this web service in a scope called message enricher scope. In the message enricher scope, you can store the response in a target variable. You can create a variable and store the response in a target variable rather than overriding the existing payload. Now at this point, the payload is X. Payload is X. If we use the message enricher scope and configure the variable, in this scenario, the service from web service is copied to the variable rather than overriding the existing payload. Okay, so these things you need to do in Mule 3.x. From the Mule 4 onwards, they did one enhancement in the connector level itself. You need to configure one variable called a target variable in the connector level itself. You need to configure a target variable. So whenever a if you have this is not a connector which is invoking web service. This is a connector, right? This connector invoking web service. In this connector, you need to configure a target variable. Target variable. So this connector calls a web service. The response from the web service is copied to the target variable rather than copying the existing payload. Assume this is a Mule-4 flow. If I Mule-4 flow, this is the inbound endpoint, and there are some processors, and this is the outbound endpoint. This is calling the some web service. So it's calling the web service, right? So this connector has need to configure with a variable called connector variable, target variable, target variable. So if you configure a target variable on a connector, the response web service is copied to the target variable rather than overriding the existing payload. So this is the usage of the target variable. So let me see this way target variable in action and let me execute the example. See, I designed a flow like this. In HTTP listener, you get the request from HTTP client like ARC, and I'm setting some payload. Now the existing payload is payload set in main flow. This is the existing payload. Okay. Afterwards, I'm invoking some VM flow. This is the VM flow. VM flow. If you see the VM queue name is VM connector. Queue name is my queue, and the corresponding my queue is over here. This is guy listening on the my queue. My queue. So the control comes here. In this flow, I'm setting a payload. What payload is it? Payload set in VM flow. So this is the payload returning from this flow. Now in this component, go to advanced, where there is a target variable. I configure target variable flow to value underscore variable. So let's see if you don't configure this variable. Now if you don't configure the variable, now the payload returning from the second flow is override the first flow payload. Okay, let's see what happens if you don't override, if you don't configure the target variable. Running the flow. The flow is getting deployed. This flow got deployed. Now we are testing a scenario where the target variable is not configured. Let me see at what port I configured this listener. I configured to a port 8081 with no path. Let me hit the 8081 from ARC and remove this query parameter. I am hitting the flow. So if we hit the flow, we got the response like this log processor after VM call payload set in VM flow null. So this is the logger statement. Where this log statement, let me see the logger. So this is the logger. At this logger, after VM call, I'm printing the payload. First I'm printing the payload. The payload is now at this point, at the logger point, the payload is the payload returned from this flow. So that is payload set in VM flow, and the variable is null. Anyway, we didn't create the variable. So that is what this logger statement is showing now. Hope you understand. Returning payload set from VM flow. Now I will configure the payload variable. Go to advanced and configure the payload variable. Now let's see how it behaves. The flow got deployed. I'm hitting the flow again. Now see the payload set in the main flow. So in this case, this is the payload. The payload set main flow is not getting disturbed by this call. It went till last point. Now if you see the logger statement, I'm showing the payload and the variable. In this payload, you can see the payload that is set in the first point, and in this variable, the payload returned from the flow to the console. Go to here. After VM call, this is the payload set in main flow. So that is the existing payload. It didn't get modified with the service call. And the second one, payload set in VM flow. This is a payload that is set in the flow to return by flow to, and that is stored inside the target variable. So this is about target variable. Please give your value comment. If any doubt, post me on the YouTube comments. We'll discuss further. Thank you so much for viewing my video. Thanks a lot.